Okay, good. Does anybody have any questions before we start?
Yeah, what chapter? Where is this?
It's in chapter 1,
Okay.
and in my book, it's on page 16, and it
Okay.
starts with a great fire banked high in red.
All right. I'm doing this online today, so I'll have to see what I can find.
Okay, so
Yeah.
just look for great fire, and it should take you right there.
I'm online as well, Duncan. This is Anne.
Mhm.
I don't have a copy of the book here, so I probably shouldn't read or anything like that. But I'm here.
Yeah, are you on Gutenberg?
I'm looking for it right now. I did find the book on Gutenberg before, so I'm looking for it
Oh,
now.
well, hold on. I've got, all I have to do is go, give me just a second. Because
If it's helpful, I have Penguin Modern Classics, and it starts on page 25.
Excuse me, I have a phone call. I'll call you.
okay, very
Okay.
good. And in the meantime, I will put
Hello?
you need to mute yourself, Ann.
Yeah, hold on. Yeah, hold on just a minute, please. Yes, hold on just a minute.
Okay, let me do that. Let me do participants. Let me go. Remind you once again that I will mute in case something comes up in your life and there's extraneous sounds coming. For the people who will be watching this on YouTube live, let me mention that today, since we're entering a new year, and since it's fairly close to Christmas time, we're going to be doing the notorious Christmas dinner scene in chapter 1, a portrait of an artist as a young man. And I encourage the readers to bring out your inner actor when possible.
I
Okay?
don't think we need encouragement.
Okay. Well, Lois, you may not. Some
Oh,
people,
no, this crowd doesn't need encouragement.
we're getting very good.
Yes.
I will say that we are getting really good. With that said, I am going to launch as the first reader. A great fire, banked high in red, flamed in the grate, and under the ivy, twin tranches of the chandelier, the Christmas table was spread. They had come home a little late, and still dinner was not ready. But it would be ready in a jiffy, his mother had said. They were waiting for the door to open and for the servants to come in, holding the big dishes covered with their heavy metal covers. All were waiting. Uncle Charles, who sat far away in the shadow of the window, Dante and Mr. Casey, who sat in the easy chairs at either side of the hearth. Stephen, seated on a chair between them, his feet resting on the toasted boss. Mr. Daedalus looked at himself in the pier glass above the mantelpiece, waxed out his mustache ends, and then, parting his coattails, stood with his back to the glowing fire. And still, from time to time, he withdrew a hand from his coat tail to wax out one of his mustache ends. Next, please.
Mr. Casey leaned his head to one side and, smiling, tapped the gland of his neck with his fingers. And Stephen smiled too, for he knew now that it was not true that Mr. Casey had a purse of silver in his throat. He smiled to think how the silvery noise which Mr. Casey used to make had deceived him. And when he had tried to open Mr. Casey's hand to see if the purse of silver was hidden there, he had seen that the fingers could not be straightened out. And Mr. Casey had told him that he had got those 3 cramped fingers making a birthday present for Queen Victoria. Mr. Casey tapped the gland of his neck and smiled at Stephen with sleepy eyes, and Mr. Dedalus said to him, "Yes, well now, that's all right. Oh, we had a good walk, hadn't we, John? Yes. I wonder, is there any likelihood of dinner this evening? Yes? Oh, well now, we got a good breath of ozone round the hedge today. Aye, bedad." He turned to Dante and said, "You didn't stir out at all, Mrs. Reardon." Dante frowned and said shortly, "No." Mr. Dedalus dropped his coattails and went over to the sideboard. He brought forth a great stone jar of whiskey from the locker and filled the decanter slowly, bending now and then to see how much he had poured in. Then, replacing the jar in the locker, he poured a little of the whiskey into 2 glasses, added a little water, and came back with them to the fireplace. Katrina.
"A thimbleful, John," he said, "just to whet your appetite." Mr. Casey took the glass, drank, and placed it near him on the mantelpiece. Then he said, "Well, I can't help thinking of our friend Christopher manufacturing—" He broke into a fit of laughter and coughing, and added, "manufacturing that champagne for those fellows." Mr. Dedalus laughed loudly. "Is it Christie?" he said. "There's more cunning in one of those warts on his bald head than in a pack of jack foxes." He inclined his head, closed his eyes, and licking his lips profusely, began to speak with the voice of the hotel keeper. "And he has such a soft mouth when he's speaking to you, don't you know? He's very moist and watery about the dewlaps, God bless him." Mr. Casey was still struggling through his fit of coughing and laughter. Stephen, seeing and hearing the hotel keeper through his father's face and voice, laughed. Mr. Dedalus put up his eyeglass and, staring down at him, said quietly and kindly, "What are you laughing at, you little puppy, you?" The servants entered and placed dishes on the table. Mrs. Dedalus followed, and the places were arranged. "Sit over," she said. Mr. Dedalus went to the end of the table and said, "Now, Mrs. Reardon, sit over. John, sit you down, my hearty." He looked around to where Uncle Charles sat and said, "Now then, sir, there's a bird here waiting for you. Next, please."
When all had taken their seats, he laid his hand on the cover and then said quickly, withdrawing it, "Now, Stephen?" Stephen stood up in his place to say the grace before meals. "Bless us, O Lord, in these thy gifts, which through thy bounty we are about to receive, through Christ our Lord. Amen." All blessed themselves, and Mr. Dedalus, with a sigh of pleasure, lifted from the dish the heavy cover pearled around the edge with glistening drops. Stephen looked at the plump turkey, which had lain trussed and skewered on the kitchen table. He knew that his father had paid a guinea for it in Dunn's of Delir Street, and that the man had prodded it often at the breastbone to show how good it was, and he remembered the man's voice when he had said, "Take that one, sir. That's the real Ali Daly." Why did Mr. Barrett and Clongowes call his pandybat a turkey? But Clongowes was far away, and the warm, heavy smell of turkey and ham and celery rose from the plates and dishes, and the great fire was backed high and red in the grate, and the green ivy and red holly made you feel so happy. And when dinner was ended, the big plum pudding would be carried in, studded with peeled almonds and sprigs of holly, with bluish fire running round it, and a little green flag flying from the top. Next, please.
It was his first Christmas dinner, and he thought of little brothers and sisters who were waiting in the nursery, as he had often waited till the pudding came. The deep low collar and the Eton jacket made him feel queer and oldish. And that morning, when his mother had brought him down to the parlour, dressed for Mass, his father had cried. That was because he was thinking of his own father, and Uncle Charles had said so too. Mr. Dedalus covered the dish and began to eat hungrily. Then he said, Poor old Christy, he's nearly lopsided now with roguery. Simon, said Mrs. Dedalus, you haven't given Mrs. Reardon any sauce. Mr. Dedalus seized the sauce bowl. Haven't I? He cried. Mrs. Reardon pitied the poor blind. Dante covered her plate with her hands and said, no thanks. Mr. Dedalus turned to Uncle Charles. How are you off, sir? Right at the mail, Simon. You, John? I'm all right. Go on yourself. Mary? Here, Stephen. Here's something to make your hair curl. He poured sauce freely over Stephen's plate and set the boat again on the table. Then he asked Uncle Charles, was it tender? Uncle Charles could not speak because his mouth was full, but he nodded that it was. That was a good answer our friend made to the canon. What? Said Mr. Dedalus. I didn't think he had that much in him, said Mr. Casey. I'll pay your dues, Father, when you are turning the house of God into a polling booth. When you cease turning the house of God into a polling booth. A nice answer, said Dante, for any man calling himself a Catholic to give to a priest. They've only themselves to blame, said Mr. Dedalus suavely. If they took a fool's advice, they would confine their attention to religion. It is religion, Dante said. They're doing their duty in warning the people. Go to the house of God, Mr. Casey said, in all humility, to pray to our Maker and not to hear election addresses. It is religion, Dante said again. They are right. They must direct their flocks. And preach politics about the altar, is it? Asked Mr. Dedalus. Certainly, said Dante. It's a question of public morality. A priest would not be a priest if he did not tell his flock what is right and what is wrong. Mrs. Dedalus bit down her knife and fork, saying, for pity's sake and for pity's sake, let us have no political discussion on this day of all days of the year. Quite right, ma'am, said Uncle Charles. Now, Simon, that's quite enough. Not another word now. Yes, yes, said Mr. Dedalus quickly. He uncovered the dish boldly and said, now then, who's for more turkey? Nobody answered. Dante said, nice language for any Catholic to use. Mrs. Reardon, I appeal to you, said Mrs. Dedalus, to let the matter drop now. Dante turned on her and said, and am I to sit here and listen to the pastors of my church being flouted? Next.
Nobody's saying a word against them, said Mr. Dedalus, so long as they don't meddle in politics. The bishops and priests of Ireland have spoken, said Dante, and they must be obeyed. Let them leave politics alone, said Mr. Casey, or the people may leave their church alone. You hear, said Dante, turning to Mrs. Dedalus. Mr. Casey, Simon, said Mrs. Dedalus, let it end now. Too bad, said Uncle Charles. What, cried Mr. Dedalus, were we to desert him at the bidding of the English people? He was no longer worthy to lead, said Dante. He was a public sinner. We are all sinners, and black sinners, said Mr. Casey coldly. Woe be to the man by whom the scandal cometh, said Mrs. Reardon. It would be better for him that a millstone were tied about his neck, and that he were cast into the depth of the sea, rather that he should scandalize one of these, my least little ones. That is the language of the Holy Ghost. And very bad language, if you ask me, said Mr. Dedalus coolly. Simon, said Uncle Charles, the boy. Yes, said Mr. Dedalus. I was thinking about the bad language of that railway porter. Well now, that's all right. Here, Stephen, show me your plate, old chap. Eat away now, here. Next, please.
He heaped up the food on Stephen's plate and served Uncle Charles and Mr. Casey to large pieces of turkey and splashes of sauce. Mrs. Dedalus was eating little, and Dante sat with her hands in her lap. She was red in the face. Mr. Dedalus rooted with the carvers at the end of the dish and said, there's a tasty bit here we call the Pope's nose. If any lady or gentleman yelled up a piece of fowl he held a piece of fowl up on the prong of the carving fork. Nobody spoke. He put it on his own plate, saying, "Well, you can't say it, but you were asked. I think I had better eat it myself, because I'm not well in my health lately." He winked at Stephen, and replacing the dish cover, began to eat again. There was a silence while he ate. Then he said, "Well now, the day kept up fine after all. There were plenty of strangers down too." Nobody spoke. He said again, "I think there were more strangers down than last Christmas." He looked round at the others, whose faces were bent towards their plates, and receiving no reply, waited for a moment and said bitterly, "Well, my Christmas dinner has been spoiled anyhow." "There could be neither luck nor grace," Dante said, "in a house where there is no respect for the pastors of the church." Mr. Dedalus threw his knife and fork noisily on his plate. "Respect," he said. "Is it for Billy with the lip, or for the tub of guts up in Armagh? Respect?" "Princes of the church," said Mr. Casey with slow scorn. "Lord Leitrim's coachman, yes," said Mr. Dedalus. "They are the Lord's anointed," Dante said. "They are an honour to their country." "Tub of guts," said Mr. Dedalus coarsely. "He has a handsome face, mind you, in repose. You should see that fellow lapping up his bacon and cabbage of a cold winter's day. Oh, Johnny!" He twisted his features into a grimace of heavy bestiality and made a lapping noise with his lips.
Okay, Mitchko.
Yeah, okay. Really, Simon, you should not speak that way before Stephen. It's not right. Oh, he'll remember all this when he grows up, said Dante hotly. The language he heard against God and religion and priests in his own home. Let him remember too, cried Mr. Casey to her from across the table. The language with which the priests and the priest's pawns broke Parnell's heart and hounded him into his grave. Let him remember that too when he grows up. Sons of bitches, cried Mr. Dedalus. When he was down, they turned on him to betray him and land him like rats in a sewer. Low-lived dogs. And they look it. By Christ, they look it. They behaved rightly, cried Dante. They obeyed their bishops and their priests. Honor to them. Well, it is perfectly dreadful to say that not even for one day in the year, said Mrs. Dedalus. Can we be free from these dreadful disputes? Uncle Charles raised his hands mildly and said, Come now, come now, come now. Can we not have our opinions, whatever they are, without this bad temper and this bad language? It is too bad, surely. Mrs. Dedalus spoke to Dante in a low voice, but Dante said loudly, I will not say nothing. I will defend my church and my religion when it is insulted and spit on by renegade Catholics. Mr. Casey pushed his plate rudely into the middle of the table and resting his elbows before him, said in a hoarse voice to his host, Tell me, did I tell you that story about a very famous spit? You did not, John, said Mr. Dedalus. Why then, said Mr. Casey, it is a most instructive story. It happened not long ago in the county Wicklow, where we are now. He broke off and turning toward Dante, said with quiet indignation. Next, please.
Okay, Anne, are you reading? You have to turn on your microphone, Anne. Are you
Yeah. Okay, here goes.
reading? Please.
Let me see. He broke off and turning towards Dante said with quiet indignation, and I may tell you, ma'am, that if you mean me, am no renegade Catholic, I am a Catholic as my father was, and his father before him, and his father before him again, when we gave up our lives rather than sell our faith. The more shame to you now, Dante said, to speak as you do. The story, John, said Mr. Daedalus, smiling. Let us have the story anyhow. Catholic indeed, repeated Dante ironically. The blackest Protestant in the land would not speak the language I have heard this evening. Mr. Daedalus began to sway his head to and fro, crooning like a country singer. I am no Protestant, I tell you again, said Mr. Casey, flushing. Mr. Daedalus, still crooning and swaying his head, began to sing in a grunting nasal tone. Oh, come all ye Roman Catholics that never went to mass. He took up his knife and fork again in good humor and set to eating, saying to Mr. Casey, let us have the story, John. It will help us to digest. Next.
Stephen looked with affection at Mr. Casey's face, which stared across the table over his joined hands. He liked to sit near him at the fire, looking up at his dark, fierce face. But his dark eyes were never fierce, and his slow voice was good to listen to. But why was he then against the priests? Because Dante must be right then. But he had heard his father say that she was a spoiled nun and that she had come out of the convent in the Alleghenies when her brother had got the money from the savages for the trinkets and the chainies. Perhaps that made her severe against Parnell. And she did not like him to play with Eileen because Eileen was a Protestant. And when she was young, she knew children that used to play with Protestants. And the Protestants used to make fun of the Litany of the Blessed Virgin. Tower of Ivory, they used to say, house of gold. How could a woman be a tower of ivory or a house of gold? Who was right then? And he remembered the evening in the infirmary in Clongowes, the dark waters, the light at the pierhead, and the moan of sorrow from the people when they heard. Eileen had long white hands. One evening when playing Tig, she had put her hands over her eyes, long and white, thin, cold, and soft. That was ivory, a cold, white thing. That was the meaning of Tower of Ivory. The story is very short and sweet, Mr. Casey said. There was one day down in Arklow, a cold, bitter day, not long before the chief died. May God have mercy on him. He closed his eyes wearily and paused. Mr. Daedalus took a bone from his plate and tore some meat from it with his teeth, saying, before he was killed, you mean. Mr. Casey opened his eyes, sighed, and went on. Next.
Joan, you need to turn on your microphone.
It was down in Arklow one day. We were down there at a meeting, and after the meeting was over, we had to make our way to the railway station through the crowd. Such booing and buying, man, you never heard. They called us all the names in the world. Well, there was one old lady, and a drunken old Harrigan she was surely, that paid her attention to me. She kept dancing along beside me in the mud, bawling and screaming into my face. Priest Hunter, the Paris Funds, Mr. Fox, Kitty O'Shea. And what did you do, John? Asked Mr. Daedalus. I let her bawl away, said Mr. Casey. It was a cold day, and to keep up my heart I had, saving your presence, ma'am, a quid of Tullamore in my mouth, and sure I couldn't say a word in any case because my mouth was full of tobacco juice. Well, John? Well, I let her bawl away to her heart's content. Kitty O'Shea and the rest of it, till at last she called that lady a name that I won't sully this Christmas board, nor your ears, ma'am, nor my own lips by repeating. He paused. Mr. Daedalus, lifting his head from the bone, asked, and what did you do, John? Do? Said Mr. Casey. She stuck her ugly old face up at me, and when she said it and I had my mouth full of tobacco juice, I bent down to her and pfft, says I to her, like that. He turned aside and made the act of spitting. Pfft, says I to her, like that, right into her eye. He clapped a hand to his eye and gave a hoarse scream of pain. Oh, Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, says she, I'm blinded and drowned. He stopped in a fit of coughing and laughter, repeating, "I'm blinded entirely." Mr. Dedalus laughed loudly and lay back in his chair while Uncle Charles swayed his head to and fro. Dante looked terribly angry and repeated while they laughed, "Very nice, ha, very nice. Next, please."
It was not nice about the spit in the woman's eye. But what was the name of the woman had called Kitty O'Shea that Mr. Casey would not repeat? He thought of Mr. Casey walking through the crowd of people and making speeches from a wagonette. That was what he had been in prison for. And he remembered that one night Sergeant O'Neill had come to the house and had stood in the hall, talking in a low voice with his father and chewing nervously at the chin strap of his cap. And that night, Mr. Casey had not gone to Dublin by train, but a car had come to the door, and he had heard his father say something about the Cabinteely Road. Next, please.
He was for Ireland and Parnell, and so was his father. And so was Dante too, for one night at the band on the Esplanade, she had hit a gentleman on the head with her umbrella because he had taken off his hat when the band played God Save the Queen at the end. Mr. Dedalus gave a snort of contempt. "Ah, John," he said, "it is true for them. We are an unfortunate, priest-ridden race, and always were, and always will be, till the end of the chapter." Uncle Charles shook his head, saying, "A bad business, Mr. Dedalus repeated. "A priest-ridden, God-forsaken race." Katrina.
He pointed to the portrait of his grandfather on the wall to his right. "Do you see that old chap up there, John?" he said. "He was a good Irishman when there was no money in the job. He was condemned to death as a white boy. But he had a saying about our clerical friends that he would never let one of them put his 2 feet under his mahogany." Dante broke in angrily. "If we are a priest-ridden race, we ought to be proud of it. They are the apple of God's eye. Touch them not, says Christ, for they are the apple of my eye." "And can we not love our country then?" asked Mr. Casey. "Are we not to follow the man that was born to lead us?" "A traitor to his country," replied Dante. "A traitor, an adulterer. The priests were right to abandon him. The priests were always the true friends of Ireland." "Were they, Faith?" said Mr. Casey. He threw his fist on the table and, frowning angrily, protruded one finger after another. Next, please.
Didn't the bishops of Ireland betray us in the time of the Union when Bishop Lanigan presented an address of loyalty to the Marquess Cornwallis? Didn't the bishops and priests sell the aspirations of their country in 1829 in return for Catholic emancipation? Didn't they denounce the Fenian movement from the pulpit and in the confession box? And didn't they dishonor the ashes of Terence Bellew McManus? His face was glowing with anger, and Stephen felt the glow rise to his own cheek as the spoken words thrilled him. Mr. Dedalus uttered a guffaw of coarse scorn. "Oh, by God," he cried, "I forgot little old Paul Cullen, another apple of God's eye." Dante bent across the table and cried to Mr. Casey, "Right, right, they were always right. God and morality and religion come first." Mrs. Dedalus, seeing her excitement, said to her, "Mrs. Reardon, don't excite yourself answering them." "God and religion before everything," Dante cried. "God and religion before the world." Mr. Casey raised his clenched fist and brought it down on the table with a crash. "Very well then," he shouted hoarsely. "If it comes to that, no God for Ireland."
John, cried Mr. Dedalus, seizing his guest by his coat sleeve. Dante stared across the table, her cheeks shaking. Mr. Casey struggled up from his chair and bent across the table towards her, scraping the air from before his eyes with one hand, as though he were tearing aside a cobweb. No God for Ireland, he cried. We have had too much God in Ireland. Away with God. Blasphemer, devil, screamed Dante, starting to her feet and almost spitting in his face. Uncle Charles and Mr. Dedalus pulled Mr. Casey back into his chair again, talking to him from both sides, reasonably. He stared before him out of his dark, flaming eyes, repeating, away with God, I say. Next.
Dante shoved her chair violently aside and left the table, upsetting her napkin ring, which rolled slowly along the carpet and came to rest against the foot of an easy chair. Mrs. Dedalus rose quickly and followed her towards the door. At the door, Dante turned round violently and shouted down the room, her cheeks flushed and quivering with rage. Devil out of hell, we won. We crushed him to death. Fiend. The door slammed behind her. Mr. Casey, freeing his arm from his holders, suddenly bowed his head on his hands with a sob of pain. Poor Parnell, he cried loudly, my dead king. He sobbed loudly and bitterly. Stephen, raising his terror-stricken face, saw that his father's eyes were full of tears. Can we go? Yes.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's pretty powerful. Every time I read it, it seems more
Yeah.
powerful.
Yeah.
I hope none of you had a Christmas dinner like that.
I know.
But I'm
Maybe.
sure that some people did this year.
This year, it's possible.
It's very possible.
Maybe next December.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What were some of these references? I hadn't caught them before, like when they were saying Bishop Lanigan presented an address of loyalty to the Marquis Cornwallis. I could see where that would betray Ireland. But then it goes on, something about 1829, something about Terence Bello McManus, and then a Paul Cullen. I've never heard those names before.
Aw.
Mhm.
I bet that within this group, we have information about all of that.
Paul Cullen was the first Irish cardinal, 1866, and a resolute organizer of the Catholic Church.
Organizer of the Catholic Church.
Yeah.
Okay.
Was this the new Catholic Church or the old Catholic Church?
Oh, I'd say it was the old one.
It would be the old one? Okay, so this was back when the priests were married and had quite a bit of.
No.
Not
Okay.
that old.
No.
Not that
Okay,
old.
This is after, what was it, Henry or somehow Adrian, the only British,
English.
the only English Pope
Yeah.
who kind of destroyed the traditional.
Oh, yeah, well, that's Norman times, isn't it?
Yeah, you're going back to the
Right
1100s.
back. This guy is in the 1850s, that kind of.
Is it like after the emancipation through the penal act?
Yes, it is. Yeah, but it's McManus was a nationalist. He was there was a movement called Young Ireland, and he was a member of that. He was arrested for it, but escaped to America, where he died as a pauper. And friends and colleagues and comrades decided to bring his body back for burial in Ireland, which they did. And
just to interject there, Joe, he was transported to Australia, and he escaped from Australia to the US.
Yeah, and he was to be lying in state here in Ireland, but McManus Cullen refused him permission for lying in state. Am I right, Donna? Have I got the name?
That's Spot on, yeah. You're
Stuff
spot on.
roughly right. So that's it. But you're kind of dealing with the rise of modern nationalism there.
Yeah.
You know, you very soon will have the Fenians, and out of that, the Irish Republican Brotherhood, and out of that, the Irish Republican Army, out of that, the War of Independence. And so
in fact, McManus was a Fenian himself.
Yeah. And was he one of the guys on the Catalpa? The Voyager?
I'm not sure about that.
Yeah, there was but there were all sorts of things. They were the Fenians are named after a mythical Fionn, you know, the warriors of Ireland who would rise up one day, sort of thing in mythology. But they were very, very powerful in America. And a number of them, I think it was 6 of them, were transported, which was a death penalty, but death by labor, to Australia around Perth. And their American colleagues hired a ship. And this is long before Al Qaeda or anything. They hired a ship called the Catalpa, which was a whaler. And they sailed, as it were, on a whaling voyage and berthed off Perth. And while the British were having a celebration of some sort, had got the word to the lads to break out, which they did. And they picked them up from a beach in Perth and sailed them on the Catalpa away towards America. The British sent a warship, which of course was faster, to intercept it. But the Brits, the master of the ship, shouted, he reminded them that the ship was flying an American flag. And dare they fire on it, and they turned back. So the lads they then went and did some whaling.
On the way back.
Well, here we have a whaler, there we have whales, we're doing this. Oh, what are we waiting for? And they did a bit of whaling and then went back sailed back to America where this group, and we think, we're not sure of our facts. He may be one of them. And they ran newspapers and all this sort of stuff. The last, I think the last newspaper in Irish was published in California. So that's kind of, no, that's from my memory. And but the Catalpa is a book called the Voyage of the Catalpa, you know. And of course the Brits tried everything to get them extradited from America, but that didn't do them a lot of good. They didn't get them. And
just going back to what you said about the lying in state.
Yeah.
Not only did the bishop ban that, but he forbade any clergy taking part in the mass.
Was that in Drogheda or in Dublin?
It was in the Pro Cathedral.
Oh, in the Pro Cathedral. Oh, yeah. Right.
And apparently one priest decided that he was going to participate.
He's going to do it.
He did it anyway, yeah. And apparently it was one of the largest funerals ever seen of a Fenian.
Yeah.
So good old, let's go, lads.
Yeah, okay. That would get all the blood would rise for that, you know.
Correct. Yeah.
But that's running through this, and our friend Charles with his finger, telling the child it's a present for Queen Victoria, is making a bomb. That's he's got his fingers.
Okay.
They tried all sorts of tricks to send British, like exploding cigars and things like this, to send to politicians, which the Americans later tried with Fidel Castro. As I recall.
Yeah. And we had Al Qaeda trying different things.
Yeah, and the champagne is a sort of a code for explosives.
Oh my
Does
God.
that answer all your questions, Anne?
But you get the mood for it.
Yeah. And then there's a guy named Mager who was transported. He was from an upper class Irish family, and he tried a rising of some sort, and he got captured and was sent to Australia, to Tasmania. And he did escape Tasmania, and he got to America, and he was even into like public office in like Wisconsin, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, in Wisconsin, and there's some thought that he was tricked into a fall from a ship, and that's how he died. But there's supposed to be a statue to him at the Wisconsin State Building or something like that.
Oh yeah.
It's
That's
not
But
interesting.
he got
Francis
into the
Horner, is it?
he got into the American Civil War too, because he wanted to identify Irishmen who could go to battle, so that they
Yeah.
would go back to Ireland with
Oh,
them.
so he was
Oh, yeah.
joined up to look for other Irish that were willing to fight.
Yeah.
And knew how to
Uh,
fight.
He was
And knew how
recruited.
to fight. See, if he went back, if he went back, he would have been apprehended, and the
Yeah.
whole thing started again. But he was looking for a military who could fight with him.
Yeah.
Mhm.
I think that was the
Francis Marr.
Yeah,
Was
Maher,
it-
Maher, is it, or?
Thomas Francis Marr. A book has been written by him. You know the guy who wrote Schindler's List?
Yes.
Yeah,
The Australian.
Thomas Keeley. Mhm.
Yes, he's written a
Wow.
book about Thomas Francis Marr, but I can't remember the name.
I read it, I believe.
yeah.
So I know the story as much as I know it.
There was
Is it possible that this Ma is buried in the Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn, New York?
Could be.
I think I went to an unveiling of a statue they put up to him about 3 or 4 years ago.
Oh. Oh.
Yeah.
Oh. Great.
was a section of the Union Army they had trouble getting to stop fighting after the end of the Civil War because they tried to march on Canada. And their plan was to take over Canada. And having taken over Canada, it would be relatively easy to go back and take over Ireland. That was their, they couldn't stop them. And they cut off their supplies eventually and they withdrawal. I think that was how it was done. And the Holland submarine, which was the first submarine in the world, was commissioned for the American Navy. It was designed by Finbar Holland, Irishman. And his purpose in designing it was he was planning to get these submarines built to encircle Ireland and defeat the Royal Navy. That was, his plan. And supplying America with its first submarine was just his first step. They had these huge plans.
Oh my. And talent.
Yeah, the Holland number 1, I think, was the model number that.
Well, my understanding was that the American authorities were not cooperative at all, that the British wanted the American government to come down on these Irish groups in the New York area, and that we, meaning the government of the United States, did not cooperate.
That's right.
And that actually lots of money, much of the money raised for rebellion in Ireland came from the United States.
And still does. And you see, it didn't help that the Brits sided with the Confederate States. And, that didn't exactly make them popular with the Union. And there was in Dawson Street in Ireland an episode of the American Civil War where a speaker was speaking on behalf of the Confederate States and encouraging Irishmen to join and that sort of thing. And a group supporting the Union got into a fight with them outside the Mansion House, inside the Mansion House and outside it. So there was this kind of occasion where police had to be turned out to deal with a dispute about the American Civil War in Dawson Street.
In Dublin. Oh,
Well, by
I think it was one of the least bloody episodes of the American Civil War.
well, the British were dependent on the cotton exports from the South.
Cotton.
That was it was money. Mhm.
That was all. The shekels. That's what it was all about.
Mhm.
And,
Right.
But it meant when the war was over and the Brits were going cap in hand looking for this, that, and the other, they were handicapped by their favoritism. So,
Wow.
And it should be pointed out that the irony was that I believe by that time that the UK had already outlawed slavery
yes.
Yeah.
in the UK.
1848, I think it was.
And then for commercial reasons, they were supporting the southern states.
Yeah.
So
And then they
history
discovered
rolls on and all of its confusions.
and they discovered India, and they started to grow cotton in India.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what Joyce calls Cottonopolis in Ulysses somewhere. You know. The king, though, isn't it? The Cottonopolis is visited by the black who dances and swallows a few forks and spoons or something to the cheers of the girls from Cottonopolis, Manchester, and all part of one. But that's it. That's a dinner conversation that could have taken place today.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah, no, all the tempers are right at that fever pitch. It was very interesting. I mean, obviously Simon Dedalus was looking for a fight.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, he was the one who initiated all of this right in the very first pages we read today.
Yeah.
And so that's real interesting. Why he would do that. Was Dante living in the house at that time, or was she already moved out? She lived with the family for a while.
I think my impression. Sorry, if someone has better, but my impression is she was still there.
Yeah. There was previous between Mr. Dedalus and Dante that went on for some time and then exploded over dinner.
Yeah. Christmas is when these things happen, isn't it?
Absolutely. It's the most unnatural time of the year when families are all shoved together that probably hate each other anyway.
Yeah, and all the kids in their 40s revert to being 2-year-olds again. You know.
Right. And then the little thimblefuls don't help that much either, you know.
That's stop it. But that if you're in Ireland, if anyone is visiting here, the house is available to visit where this takes place. And number 1 Martello Terrace in Bray. And it's very good. It's very good. It's one of its residents. What's the name of the lady that lives there? Does anyone know?
McManus, yeah.
Liz McManus. Were you down there, Tom?
I was, yeah.
Yeah, was that one of our trips together? I used to take a group down there from Swinney's, you know, the regular readers, because it opens, I think, from May to September. But you're visiting a lived-in house. It's big. And Liz is the former deputy leader of the Labour Party. So she's an Irish politician. I think she's retired really from politics, effectively. And she, you know, with notice in advance, I could bring the group in and we could sit and read that story around that table.
That's lovely.
And it was great fun because you suddenly realize there's the fireplace. If your man is heating his backside to it and he's talking and if he points to a picture on the right, he's actually pointing to a window. But there's room for a slim photograph beside or a portrait. So it's not a great big 6-foot by 20-foot portrait of the grandfather. It's a slim, probably a photograph. And you get that sense of detail. And, you know, we kind of tried to figure out where people were sitting and then get them to read the part. That's and if Liz likes you, if you behave yourself and you know you're well mannered, she lets you go upstairs. And you see it's a preserved house. She's not allowed to alter it, and because of that, she can get tax advantage if she opens it for free. You know, you just need to know the phone number and behave yourself when you ring her, and and then she can write off part of the maintenance against her tax. So that's the deal. But if you go upstairs, you see this, what they used to call isn't it called the piano room? The the piano. It's nothing to do with music. It's just the name, it's the Italian name for it. And that looks out, straddles the building, looks out on Bray Head. And you can see a lot of the places in Portrait. You can see if you're what's her name? Eileen Vance.
Eileen, yeah.
You can, if you want to go and see where she and Stephen watched the flag being raised at the hotel, you can find that spot because of Joyce's description of the curve. And it's like, if you're in Ireland, it's a fantastic visit to do. And you can you could go for that walk around Bray Head if you wanted.
Is there a website for the house?
I don't think so. Like it's not a place where there's any staff or anything like that. You're going to someone's house, you know. So if you get the phone number, which you might get from someone who knows, and if you go to Sweeney's and ask someone there behind the counter, they'll be able to tell you how to do it. And you might probably get the phone number. Liz O'Donnell, if you Googled her, you might get a phone number, you know. But you'd also get it in the newspapers. Does
Liz offer tea? Sorry, Joe, does Liz offer tea and cakes?
Come on. You get us all barred.
Harbour Bar is just around the corner, Donna.
Yeah.
Oh, very good.
and it's very interesting because you realise, I know Joyce spent 6 nights in the Tower up in Sandy Cove.
Yeah.
But if you go out and turn the corner, you'll find another tower in his childhood, another Martello Tower. And in his childhood, there were 2 of them within 100 yards of the house. Number 1 was built where the music stand is now on Bray. It was destroyed in a flood, water damage. And the other one ran the side of the house. And they're currently owned by one of those musician chaps from, what's he called? I can't remember the name of the group even. Oh, come on, John, help me.
Not John, U2 by any chance?
U2 and Bono from U2. Yeah. I doubt if he lives in it, but he owns it anyway.
He lives on Vico Road.
Yeah, well, there you go. And but I think, you know, I don't know if it's true. You know, because everyone says he does.
It's a good story.
It's never open. But you can see that baby Joyce, baby James, you know, could have been fascinated by circular buildings from a very, very early age, looking out that window. And so it's all this comes to you, you know, and you sort of feel you've had a great experience.
It's an interesting little terrace of houses there. I think it's from number 1 to 6. But Mary Coughlan, the Irish singer, lived in one of them there, and Neil Jordan, the director, lived in one of them there for a while as well. In fact, in the same house, Mary Coughlan moved in and Neil Jordan moved out. But he made a film in the late 80s in Bray called The Miracle. It's a beautiful little film. But Jordan, while he was there, he made the film there, and it's well worth seeing. You know, Jordan seems to be taken up with circuses and that, because he has a circus come to Bray, and it's a fabulous little film. But he made it while he was staying there. But he stayed along in one of those houses.
Martello. And in number 4 was Vance. I think in Portrait it's given as number 7, but Vance's. And there's a terrific article if you Google for it called "The Girl James Joyce Did Not Marry."
Yeah,
and it's a great story. Like, you know, there were neighbours at 6 and 7 years of age, and their fathers used to joke they would get married.
Yeah,
and but she emigrated. Vance has emigrated to Canada, I think it was, and later on discovered herself in Portrait, and returned as a mature woman to Bray and all that story. But it's fantastic. The Girl James Joyce Did Not Marry.
I don't know if any of you looked at the Irish Times at the weekend, because O'Connor, Sinead O'Connor, this is stream of consciousness. Sinead O'Connor's brother is a writer. Sinead O'Connor lived in Bray, along Bray Head. The brother wrote an article at the weekend, and he's recommending that everyone read Dubliners for January. That is good for the spirit. And now you've all read Dubliners already. So, but apparently it's really good for the spirit to start the year with a book like that.
And there's a program on Sinead tonight on the TV.
Well, I believe that actually next Monday, we're probably going to read Dubliners while we're making up our mind what our next one is. That we're going to be using Dubliner stories as bridges. So, and I guess we would just start with story number 1 and maybe 2. I'm not sure how long it takes to read them.
Yeah.
Maybe
the early ones are relatively short.
Okay. Okay. So let's just assume we'll probably read 2 of the Dubliner stories next week, and we'll have another conversation about what we're going to be reading. I wanted to mention that I really enjoyed young Stephen Dedalus's bewilderment at all these shenanigans going on, because this was his first Christmas dinner with the adults.
Yeah.
And
that line in it where one of them says, not in front of the child, he'll remember this when he grows up, I think it's, and this is Joyce writing it much later, of course. Yeah. But I think the whole thing is really centers on the father. He's such a kind of he drives the whole thing, and he has all these phrases that he has that encourages Mr. Whoever it is, Casey, to tell the story. He just wants more ammunition, more fuel, so he can really pin the whole thing down. But I mean, Joyce said, that Ulysses, 80% of Ulysses was attributed to his father's life, and his father, what his father said, and the phrases he used, and all this kind of stuff. And of course, a lot of Ulysses, the characters in Ulysses a lot of them would be friends of his father rather than of Stephen Dedalus. He peoples the whole book with those kind of people, yeah. But I think the whole thing belongs to him. But as you say, Duncan, the child is there watching, and he's fascinated, and he likes, and that little kind of thing where he talks about, he's just fascinated by Casey as well, and that kind of thing, yeah.
And
at the end, Tom, doesn't he?
By the passion that
like a terror-stricken place.
Yeah.
That to see adults behave like this must have frightened the life out of them.
Frightened them, yeah. And
I think that this is probably going too far, but I will go too far. I think that the father is an early social media guy, where he just has to keep things going all the time. That he literally cannot sit down for a quiet Christmas dinner. He's got to stir things up. And almost everything that he comes out of his head is not really well thought through. Kind of just stuff that he likes, that he's grabbed onto, that he throws out again. So it seems to me. Whereas the son is reflecting. He's how old is he in this scene? He's very young, right? He's like
Mm.
7 or 8 or something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. At that age group, he's just started school, real school.
Okay. And he's already reflecting upon what is going on around him. He's not just grabbing onto it and going with the program. He's kind of like, what is this? What is in the silver thing and you know these phrases that he's hearing, and then of course it's kind of, you're lucky if when you're that age, if you're smart enough to really realize that your father is covering up and lying to you.
Yeah, you kind of know though, but you don't mind because he's not misleading you.
As a kid like that, he'd have felt the tension around the table. And I doubt if he would have been mature enough to understand it. I mean, he may have understood it on a certain level, but I think it scared him. And that's why we had the stricken face being raised at the end, that these adults were not meeting the regular conventions. They were letting their hair down, essentially. And as I said earlier, I think there was previous between Dante and Mr. Dedalus, and this came to the fore, and then there were sides to be taken and forces to be joined, and then Mrs. Dedalus was the peacemaker and trying to get through her dinner without any further trouble.
Right. She and Charles are the adults in the group, or at least trying to be adults.
Yeah.
Casey, Dante, and the father are just, they are determined.
Yeah.
No, he's like the way he says that tub of guts up in Armagh.
Yeah.
He kind of obliterates the clergy again and again, and he's no problem doing it.
Yeah.
And
How about the tobacco juice?
Yeah.
I'm blinded entirely. I'm entirely blinded.
Yeah.
Very vivid.
What was the reference to Paris funds in terms of Kitty O'Shea and Parnell? Was there some malfeasance he was charged with in terms of money?
No, I think they had the money there. I just saw it a while ago, so that the British couldn't get it here.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
Oh,
that's it exactly, Anne. Yeah, it was the Irish Parliamentary Party funds.
Oh,
they kept them in Paris so that the British government couldn't sequester the funds.
Wow.
It's an offshore tax regime like we have now.
This is off the topic, but it is the music of Ireland. I was watching YouTubes about the Pogues. Does anybody from Ireland want to say how revered they were? Or Pogue is an Irish word James Joyce used apparently in Ulysses, and it means kiss my ass.
But that's Pogue Mahone.
Yeah.
But Pogue is a kiss.
Yeah. So that was the name of this music group from Dublin.
Well, it was Shane MacGowan and the Pogues, and I think the reverence, correct me if I'm wrong, anybody, but the reverence was for Shane MacGowan more so.
Yeah. Yes, it was.
But it was a split reverence, because the priest who had held up Finnegan's Wake and had the service, I believe, has been severely criticized from some other churchmen.
Well, because there was dancing in the church and
and because Shane MacGowan's wife jumped over one of the pews and started dancing in the aisle.
Yeah.
It's a bit wild for a Catholic church, all right.
There you
Wow.
go. You see, this is in the dead as well. This is why the Pope had to ban the women from the choirs.
Absolutely.
Oh, that was in the dead, yeah. Oh, boy.
As they say here, the country will never be settled.
Yes. So
Oh.
the world's largest open air asylum, really, you know.
But it's important that all the lunatics are in the one asylum.
Yeah.
Aw.
Oh dear.
No.
Good. So have we agreed we're going to begin next week reading some of the Dubliner stories?
Yes.
Yeah, that
Yeah.
would be good.
Okay.
I'd like that.
I
It's
always
history.
love that.
Okay, and then we also have a bit of a discussion at the end for some nominations. Bill Kennedy was pushing for the Tane.
The Tane?
Is that how you?
What is that?
The time?
John, the Ton.
The
Colin
Tane.
O'Cooley.
Yeah.
Okay.
I thought he wanted,
Tristan and Shandy.
yeah, Tristan Shandy.
Oh, that too.
Mention Tristan Shandy?
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
I see.
What was the other one you just said? I don't know that one.
Yeah, what was that? The Tyne or what is it?
Yeah.
The Ton.
T-A-I-N.
Okay.
It's an older
It's the
story.
Ton Bo Coolna. It's Cooley's cow. It's a sort of a war story, really.
Yeah, didn't they make a movie out of that? Seems to me they did.
Could be right.
Don't know.
It's a rather, at least my copy of it, it's a rather small book.
Are there various editions or would we have trouble with various editions? Or does it matter?
I'm not enough of an expert to know.
Yeah,
I don't know.
Joe or
Alright.
Donna?
Is it Thomas Kinsella?
Is
The
he
Tom
the-
Beaucoulier written by or rewritten by Thomas Kinsella
That's,
with
yeah.
illustrations by Louis Le Brochet.
Yes,
And
or
I
you're
don't
right.
Okay.
Copy, but it's probably gone. So I'll be out there with everybody else rummaging through bookshops.
Okay, well, I assume everybody has a copy of Dubliners, so
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
we can do that easily. And
Yeah.
you know, we'll have a bit of a discussion next week about what we may want to read. And of course we can continue with Dubliners. My vision, though, someone certainly can bring up a different idea. My vision is that the Dubliners can be a bridge as we go through some other projects. You know?
Mhm.
And there's certainly, we actually have both Joe and Donna participated in the Joyce Center course on the
Yeah.
Dublin,
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah.
As did Bill.
as did Bill Kennedy.
Yeah.
Okay, well, there we go.
So you can share all your learned knowledge from the Joyce Centre.
I've already shared it with Duncan, so I expect him to participate fully.
Okay, here we go. So maybe we're ready to wrap this up for today.
Okay.
So,
Yeah, it's been great. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you.
great.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye now.
It'll be Monday again right away.